property okay at the fabulous house of William Kohida, who is one of the organizing artists along with Jennifer Dalton for Month to Month, an event of which you were at, organized by More Art. We're so happy to have you, and tonight's discussion is private property okay? Ask the essential question, is private property okay? Well, is it? If you think that it is, can you share why? If you don't think it is okay, why not? Either way, do we think private property is working for the vast majority of New Yorkers? This is an opportunity to have a philosophical discussion, perhaps even a moral discussion, about private property, ownership, the market, and capitalism as the primary logical engine of the global economy. We also agree with and start from, I'm going to do this now. With the premise forwarded by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, property and law are born together and die together. Before laws were made, there was no property. Take away laws and property ceases. Now, this is a pretty existential and complicated discussion, and we want to talk about a couple ways that we can have a really productive and respectful discussion. So I'm going to read some rules or perhaps guidelines to govern this discussion, and I will be your facilitator. Enforcer. Yeah, that's a much better word. So this is an open discussion with a few guidelines, and we invite everyone to speak. In order to do so, we ask that you follow the 3 before me rule. That means if you speak or if I speak, we ask you to let 3 more people speak before you speak again. And then number 2 is step back, step back. Step up, step back. If you are a white male, let's be honest, and accustomed to speaking first, think about taking a step back and listening for a change. If you are not a white male, you are encouraged to step up and speak first. 3rd rule, don't interrupt. It's a common habit among men, but we'd like to try and encourage you not to interrupt the speaker. If you have a response, please wait until the speaker's finished. Yeah, eat. Yes. That also means that we would like to avoid any crosstalk or side talk during the dinner discussion. 4th rule, stay in the I. Please try and ground your thoughts in your own experience and not generalize. Please don't use we, or even worse, they, but rather related to your own personal opinion. And lastly, reverse the stack. During the conversation, I, Larissa Renter, will be keeping score of your comments, and I will politely ask you to perhaps foreshorten your statements or just wait if I find that you're dominating the conversation. So again, thank you all for being here, and we're very much looking forward to this discussion. And enjoy this wonderful feast prepared by Chef Beth.
Thank you, Chef. So it's pretty wide open. We want to have one discussion if we can. I mean, it's a pretty small space. We should be able to all hear each other. And anyone who wants to can start, but we just want to consider, like, it's almost like the air we breathe. Like, private property is just, like capitalism, private property is just, it's so inherent to our lives. But what happens if we step back and look at it? And anyone can start if they have any thoughts.
Well, the Indians didn't believe in private property. I'll start there. We start from the founding of the country.
So, what does that make you think?
Well, no, I mean, it's just,
All right.
I guess the first thing that came to my mind is like, Europeans came over and.
Don't touch it. Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
In England, you never own anything. You just rented it from long-term lease from the.
I'm sorry. In where?
In England, like you're just renting a long-term lease from the Earl of whatever the lord that owns the actual ground that your property sits on. And so I feel like it is pretty uniquely tied to the American system that you actually own the property yourself. So I think that I agree. This is the first thing that I thought was tied with our unique system of government.
I think it's kind of interesting when we talk about how much airtime we can have as speakers at this table. We also don't talk about the quantitative or qualitative amount of property you can own, like how much, like, or what proportion or what proportion of the city's property do people own and how much is that relative to their person?
Wait, I'm not sure I follow, what do you mean?
Like when we talk about owning, like being owners of property, are we talking about like we talked about the proportion of airtime we can have at this table, but we don't talk about how much property you can have relative to what sustains you.
So what do you think? Like, do you think people should be able to own lots of property, or should they be able to own what they need? I mean, do you have an opinion on that, I guess?
I wonder if there's a way to qualify like what you need and if you can own that. And then if you go beyond that, if you just start paying some gigantic taxes, or I don't know what the remedy is to it, but I think it's interesting the disproportionate amount, like the sort of square footage people own as it relates to their own physical person and their needs.
So I would maybe try to reframe that, in the sense that first we're asking, is private property okay? And I'd love to know people's responses to that question. And if yes, then there's sort of a second question, okay, so private property is okay, but then how much is okay?
Or are constraints on that right, okay?
I.e. regulation. Government
How would you structure
regulation versus, individual rights as an owner to do what you want.
It's interesting because New York has so many co-ops. I'm just thinking in this moment, in this very moment, you own shares in a co-op, right? So you don't really own your place, your apartment, and you don't, we all know about co-ops.
No, I mean,
They're very controlling, so you don't really have full control of what you think you even own, which is really shares. So I don't know, it's kind of,
well, there's a lot of renters here and we don't own as renters, so it's interesting, to kind of maybe discuss the co-op model or share a little bit about what that means or how you participate in that as an
fully
owner.
aware there's a whole table in front of me of winners, just addressing, we happen to live in if you tend to own something, you might likely own a co-op. So, I don't even know if I can discuss it intelligently yet, it's so complicated, but a co-op is, it means you own shares. The building has a total amount of shares, and those shares are each floor based on square footage and other things that I don't really understand totally. Assign amount of shares your unit yields. And so when you buy your unit, you actually buy shares in the total shares of the building. So you don't, in theory, own a physical space of the building. You own shares in a building that you cooperate together to own. And there's common shares, so everybody has responsibility for the common shares. And then there's the shares that are private to you that you own. And then there are co-op rules, so the co-op has bylines and bylaws and all kinds of, usually about this thick of things. So in reality, you think you own your place, but you actually own the privilege of adhering to the bylaws of the co-op, which supersede actually laws.
My mother owns a co-op and I'm living with her, and she just bought it last year. Yes, there are a list of agreements that you have to adhere to and sign, and it takes a long time to actually finally own the building. So when you're purchasing, not the building, the apartment or space unit, you have to have a certain amount, you have to pay a certain amount of taxes in order to buy it, so that they know that you can pay the maintenance fee every month. And yes, there's a maintenance fee.
Oh, I left out the maintenance.
Yeah, which goes towards maintenance of the building and the laundry room and paying the doorman and things like that. And then there's a board for the co-op, so the residents of the building can apply to become part of the board, and they kind of make decisions, and all the residents are encouraged to participate during certain meetings. That's the extent that I know. And if you want to alter something in your apartment, let's say you want to add a room or add a partition, you have to go through the board. You have to ask for permission.
I wanted to mention something. In talking to you guys here about co-ops, what's interesting, it sounds like a tenants union that's built into the fact of being an owner. And it's interesting that this, even though you own shares in the property, it's basically a built-in power structure that renters don't always get or have or form. And does anybody, and I'm sorry if I'm hijacking the conversation, but does anybody here, okay, but yeah, does anybody here, are they part of a tenants union, or has you ever been part of like a tenants movement or anything like that? Do you want to speak about that? After you finish doing?
I worked with a tenants organization in Chinatown to develop a project. As a tenants union that's fighting landlord eviction and harassment, which is a huge issue there. But there are all sorts of things that stand in the way of becoming a part of a tenants union, including the very landlord harassment that you are trying to combat with that union. And I don't think it's that common of a model anymore. I think like tenant activism was probably a lot more strong in the 1930s and 40s. And now that we maybe have, and this is speculation, but we have more of an idea that we're going to bear it on our own, or that there's no kind of people don't see across like as this thing that we do together. But I know like Crown Heights Tenants Union has a sort of is a rising star in that that world. I would encourage everyone to check out their work and go to their meetings.
Can I ask a question of the owners in the room? How many of you actually own property without a mortgage?
Sorry?
Own property without a mortgage?
Well, when you're in a co-op, you always have the building always has a mortgage.
Right, so no.
And
I mean,
Free.
that,
Free.
like,
Free.
free and clear. You don't own a bank. You don't,
So in other
you,
words,
a bank does not.
my building has a mortgage out, so I have to, a part of my maintenance is towards paying that mortgage. So, and then individually, if someone buys an apartment, they can have a mortgage on the apartment, so most buildings, co-op buildings, and I don't know about condominiums, usually have some kind of mortgage, just on the building itself. And then individuals may have a mortgage on their individual apartments.
But like you as an individual,
Yeah,
you
the
have a mortgage?
I don't have a mortgage, no.
You own
For
your
a long
apartment.
time.
no, I was just saying, the way it's structured is, you have a co-op and you own your apartment and then you have maintenance that pays for certain things that happen, and then if something happens to the building, you have an assessment, and then you have to, as a member of the co-op, you have to pay money to the building to help, like, let's say the brickwork isn't working, you have to then provide money to the building to help maintain the building, so you're part of,
You can be
it's
let out
complicated, it's.
out of nowhere. You
Out
get
of nowhere, you can, like, let's say the building is unable to pay its bills for getting a new boiler, or taking care of the front, or dealing with the sidewalk in front. As a tenant, as an owner, you have to then, they can take out an assessment, and all the owners in the co-op are responsible for paying X amount of money to take care of those issues in the building. So that's part of the
Right,
co-op.
so I guess it's
complicated.
but that's vaguely similar to like, I own a single family
Right.
home, and if something goes wrong,
You
I
have to
have to
pay
find
for
the
it.
money, yeah.
You got to find the money, that's where, that's
Right,
where.
but you
you
don't
might
have
not be
to
included.
agree with eight
Yes,
people
no.
about
Yeah.
how to do that.
Yeah.
Right, and that's where it gets complicated.
But in a way, I guess that also the question is what's really the difference between a condo and a co-op? Co-op as an entity almost exists only in New York. I never heard about a co-op really. I'm sure there is in many other places and you have many exceptions, but generally it's not as common. but my question is that everything that you've been saying about co-op applies to condos as well. So what's the difference, and why New York, most of the, especially old buildings in New York are all co-ops? Does anyone know? Question, maybe nobody knows.
I do know that people have more control over their individual places in condos, which is why Chinese and other foreign investors buy condos, not co-ops.
Right.
Because co-ops have very strict regulations about renting those out and actual people living in them and who's living in them and why. So I think that co-ops existed in New York as, you know, a kind of activist social project where people would share maintenance over a large project, and artists have come together and formed co-ops.
And
and
that's
studio
different
buildings and all
though, those
sorts
are
of
the
things.
artists, right?
Well, but I'm saying it's the same co-op structure, it's
Yeah.
a legal entity.
I think that's maybe the main difference is that co-ops come from like a very liberal,
Yeah.
leftist bent, whereas condos come from a very like right-wing consumerist.
But I think it's turning to the opposite.
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's a capitalist communist
Totally
debate, right?
opposite.
Of course,
Is
but
private property
but-
okay? That's bigger than just property, I think. Yeah, it's like, do I own this or is it everyone's to share? It's like,
I'm gonna go on this side of the table because I've noticed that it's not a gender line, it's a renter-owner line. And this isn't judgment, but renters, you gotta up your game in speaking. And so, please, go ahead.
I think it can be hard to like answer the question whether or not private property is okay when you own no private property. Like you're trying to figure out like the place you can get to where you can own private property, and once you can, then you're like faced with that question, and then you have to try to answer for yourself. But I know like recently I had a friend that came over from Copenhagen, and there's like a law in Copenhagen that if you rent a place for 2 years, the landlord has to make it available to you for sale. So like it's a buyer's economy over there. Like pretty much everyone owns their apartments, even when they're like in their late 20s. Which like to me sounded really ideal. But then like when you enter a conversation like this, you might start to question like is that like a utopian ideal, or are there like a bunch of other problems that come about when you have like everyone owning and then things stay much more like solid, and like I mean gentrification won't happen as quickly, but it still will happen, and then maybe be even harder to undo because so many people are owning their apartments and then sticking around for a long
But
time.
how do the young people have the money to buy the apartments, even if they have the opportunity? You know, that like, even if they're given the option, how do they have the money to buy the apartment?
I think it's not cheap, but it's cheaper than New York, and it's also like you take out mortgages, because if you can't rent for over, you know, if you've been in a place for 2 years, you don't want to move to a new place and start renting again, so you just like continue paying like similar monthly payments, but you've just taken out a mortgage.
But you don't have to come up with a down payment, or do you now? Because that's
So-
that's the thing that keeps people from being able to buy is the down payment.
When I was in Germany
Uh-huh.
many years ago, we were visiting a family friend, and she was marrying a German guy, and he, you know, when I asked about their apartment, it was a beautiful, wonderful apartment, and they're like, oh, we live here, we own this, and I was like, how is that possible? You're our same age, we're renting, and now you own. And he's like, oh, my parents bought the house for me. It's very common in Germany for parents to buy the homes. And I'm like, how's that possible? And he's like, well, our colleges are free.
Yeah.
And I was like, damn.
Yeah.
And so when we're talking about Europe, it may be more common in Europe, you know, where education is free and people are
And
earning
you end up with
student
no
debt.
debt.
We're basically taking out
So it's like
mortgages
two
for
debts.
college.
Yeah.
I've got a mortgage for college and I've got a mortgage for a home.
Yeah.
You know, so that's, I mean, I'm a proud renter, sad renter. But I would just offer, I think, having lived in America my entire life, private property is okay.
let's
Okay, I think it's okay, but the question of regulation and where it comes from and who it's coming from, and is it a co-op where people decide together to put restrictions on the use of their land, which the building is built on, which is different from the land, right? And then the building becomes a thing, and you know, a condo, it's fragmented, you know, individual use, everyone making their own decisions about it. Maybe there's some restrictions, but a co-op has very strong restrictions. And that sort of seems to be maybe the main question is, should there be regulation on our property? You know, should there be restrictions on how it's used, including the cost of rent, you know, or how much a building is sold for? You know, this building's listed at about $600,000, but my God, I mean, Andrew, anyone want to take a guess what you could probably ask for it on the market
Easily
right
double.
now?
Easily double.
More than double.
Yeah,
I mean, there's 6 units. It's gotta be a few million.
I mean, the socialist in me is very much, I would, maybe private property in the sense of where did the land come from and who took it from Native Americans. My family did that. They were Dutch settlers, so Remsen Avenue, it's like my middle name. I have to kind of contend with thinking about that, you know, living here. But that's my feeling. Private property is okay. It's our world. So, but how do we proceed in a city where we're facing an affordability crisis?
I just, because I live in a co-op that has condo rules, so it's a little unusual because, so it's not so strict, but, and it's a big building.
Just put 'em on.
But what's really driven up prices is that so many, because it's in the NYU neighborhood, so many people have bought for investment. And they're foreign, and they're putting their kids in the apartments because it's cheaper than them renting an apartment. I mean, they have the money to buy the apartment, and then their kid can be at NYU. And so, you know, and have a roommate in the one bedroom or whatever. So, the problem with, if when you have a co-op is that all of a sudden, things are sort of, they're not respecting the space, you know, like they're students. So they're, like I had some in my hallway renting where I was like, okay, now I'm living in a dorm, you know. But I think the issue is New York City, and what I've read with London, New York, and some, you know, some primary big cities is a lot of foreign investors are buying up, you know, these luxury condos that keep going up. Like there's a big one that's going to go up on University Place where Bowmore used to be, and that's kind of my neighborhood that I've been in for a really long time. And those are the things that you're like, well, wait a minute, Bowmore's gone, you know, like Crystal Bowling and things like that. But it's a luxury condo, and I'm like, how many more luxury condos does the city need? But who's buying them? People who are just parking their money in the United States.
Yeah, shelters.
And as shelters, and so that's what's really driving the prices up. I mean, the prices in my building are ridiculous. They're ridiculous. I mean, if I was going to retire and move somewhere else, I would sell. But that's what's keeping Manhattan from being interesting anymore in the New York area, where artists can be and live and you know, create. And so I think, you know, it's a really big problem, and it is kind of global, that developers are adhering to, you know, the price of the dollar, and the buildings going up are just obscene of who can afford to live there. Even in my building, where it was a rental building, and we have some real old-time Greenwich Villagers who have lived there since the very beginning, but, you know, like, they can't move out. They can afford, like, I can't afford what I own right now. If I sold it, I'd have to move out of New York.
I think probably
All of
almost
us.
every owner here would
I
say
just
that.
say, I can't, it was like, why don't you sell it? I was like, well, after I pay the realtor and capital gains tax, then, you know, basically I can't buy what I have. So, for that level too, we're sort of stuck, where we need to hang on to what we have if we wanna stay in New York.
I find renting to be very liberating. I've been an owner in the past. I also think about the car that I used to own. It's very similar to a condo I used to own, and I'm so happy to be rid of it now. Like, it provides so much flexibility. Thinking about that car, like, I use the car to go, my family does, and we don't have to worry about the hassle of car ownership and replacing the tires or maintenance on it and things like that. So it's almost a privilege to be able to use like car sharing service or take taxis everywhere. It's almost like enhancement in the lifestyle. So the thing I think about is don't regulate it, or don't force people to live a certain way. but eventually ownership will go away through market forces, meaning people who live in luxury now choose not to own a yacht because it's not as convenient as it is just to rent it for a week.
Flies, floats, or
So I have an interesting topic on this. Like, we're talking about private ownership, and we use a lot of the same things. Like, I don't know how many people like have looked at the roads recently, but this rash of development is kind of destroying infrastructure. And what do we think? Like, it seems to me like maybe a tax that's like maybe proportional to the investment that some developer is making to rebuild the infrastructure could A, slow down development to like a rational level, and B, like, you know, maybe not have a crumbling city with these sparkling towers.
Wouldn't it be interesting, like, you know how you have to pay New York City taxes if you live in New York City over a certain number of days, then you have to pay them? But if they switched it and like, if you own an apartment and you only live in New York for 2 months out of the year, you have to pay a larger portion of taxes than if you
A
like.
vacancy tax.
Yeah, yeah. Like that would probably.
So, I mean, I'm hearing a couple of different things that are really interesting. One is, I mean, to Andy, your comment about car sharing, that's sort of a thing where like, it's a thing that we could all use at different times and negotiate, and the market sort of works for that. But then the home, you know, like we see it with Airbnb where people are kind of forced to maybe to share their home, or, you know, private property is one thing and then privacy is another. And you're, you know, is it a right to have a space? I mean, in one of our other discussions, somebody was like, boy, we just need to get back to like that model over in India where like every family is living in a tiny little spot in the house and maximizing the use of a space, but you don't have any privacy. You know, where to not live with roommates is sort of a sign of maturity in this city, or, you know, to have your own space that you don't share with someone else seems to be different than maybe a car. Whereas, but, you know, don't get me wrong, some places owning your car, that's like your sanctuary, right? So, you know, I think that's an interesting thing. And then the other side of it, like penalizing developers to disincentivize them from building condos that are just bought by speculative, you know, buyers from outside of the country, which I also would say there's a portion of what's happening, but not the primary thing, right? It's not like there's just empty condos along the Williamsburg waterfront, whole empty buildings. There's a lot of people live there. The other thing is, what are the incentives? You know, do we incentivize any landlords to do the right thing? And it becomes a question of when you take a space and divide it and fragment it up and put it on the individual to do the right thing, which is, I don't know what that is around housing, but it's an open question. Like, you know, my landlord, I didn't put it on here as a joke. He has told me, he's like, look, when I was at the dog park, I could get $2,000 a month for this apartment. What can you pay? I was like, we could do $1,750, and that was a $300 increase, just, you know, moving forward.
right.
And that's just a negotiation with one person. This used to be rent stabilized, it's no longer rent stabilized. So these kind of questions of, are there solutions to some of these problems? Because on one hand, I've heard private property is okay, except if it's a foreign investor who's not using the space, or it's empty, and that should be penalized, you know, or that, you know, we could share things more, and that would be good with a car and frees you up from stuff. It could be liberating, but then I don't want to share my apartment. You know, like my wife's gonna leave me. You know, she's really unhappy right now. She's like, I want to go back to my studio, get the hell out. I don't want to hang out with people in this place. So it's very real. But I just would put that out there, that there's a couple of different things sort of being discussed.
Can I just, are you saying, this is your place, right? You rent it?
Mm-hmm.
Can I interrupt for a minute, for folks down there who want pizza?
Yeah, can we
Yeah.
pass, we
Do you
can
want
pass
to
this
pass
pizza
plates
down,
up or
because
pass it
it's,
back to
yeah.
Michaela's trying to serve individuals, but just put it on the table and choose what you want. Sorry.
I think, but there is something to be said, just to kind of circle back around the very first thing that we talked about with this tie into the American psyche and ownership. And I think at some point something was brought up about that makes New York less interesting. But I feel like it has made Bushwick more interesting, or New York, Manhattan less interesting, but then Bushwick has become more interesting. And I'm in some ways, and maybe that'll move on to somewhere else. But I think that investor mentality can't be dismissed as altogether evil, like what you were saying with disincentivizing development. To do that, to entirely disincentivize it would be a bad thing as well, because I feel like there is something to say for what was sort of the investment that was made in this area, and then what it became now, and now then it's the double-edged sword of it's turning against the people who might have created it in the first place, by increasing rents. And anyway, I don't really know what that is saying, other than like that there is something, I think, inherently creates ambition to have the capitalistic draw of like, well, if I go out to the outskirts and I buy something and then wait for the, and improve the area, then I will benefit as well. It's totally bad.
Northeast Kingdom, right?
Yeah, right? I mean,
They're moving
cash
upstate.
out.
Jess, go ahead.
So I don't really mean to take the conversation to a left turn, right? But we're talking about property. I think it's important to think about how what you define property as, right? Because we're talking about infrastructure and land and buildings, but I can't help think about property as my body and our bodies, and the influence that our bodies have on this conversation completely, right? Is private property okay? So when you think about the notion of the body and property, do I own my body? Do you own your body? And I don't know, my thoughts are kind of jumbled between talking about this property that we had and thinking about how our bodies play a role in that, and what we are to other people playing a role in that, right? Like, I can't help think about like gentrification in the sense that like, yeah, I'm a white girl moving into Ridgewood and Bushwick, and so I don't know, is anybody else thinking about like your body and how your body plays a role into private property? Like, is your body private? Is your body property? Like you were talking about before, like biopolitical power, like a co-op, like where can I live? Where can I go? What neighborhood am I in? Like property is not just about infrastructure or land. Like we have to take into account that without our bodies, we don't really have a need for any of this other stuff at all. So like,
and I would say in our context, intangible property, cultural property, these are all forms of property that, to get back to Bill's original question, we immediately went into, like you said, real estate, we immediately went into capital property. But there's so many types of property that are different than what we're currently talking about that privacy may or may not play a role into. And also, as you were saying, Bill, the question of what privacy is, the assumption that privacy is good is a very recent invention in human history. It's a humanist notion that private individualism is the best. And certainly,
No,
It's what?
Sorry.
let him finish his thought and then you can respond.
well, is that, and that's not at an equal level across the entire world. Like the discussion with Felix bringing up with the Indian code of living, or rather group living.
Well, I just kind of wonder, how much the market that we are all living in sort of has constituted our desires. Because when I moved to New York, it wasn't an owner's place, it was a city of renters. And there were squats, and people were dealing with communal lifestyles in Berlin and London, and people were like doing like electricity that you would put quarters in so that the building could have it. I mean, if we were living in a disgusting, crime-ridden place that was New York when I first came here as a student in the 80s, no one wanted to own anything. Like, no one wanted to own this. No one wanted to, I mean, people
George McEwen is
People
also
did
a
it.
movement.
I mean, I have colleagues who are in their 70s who now own places in the West Village that they're renting out for 10, 15 grand a month, and they're like the lucky ones or whatever. But I just feel like it's interesting that the desire to own is because of all these success stories of people who have owned, but there's probably other kinds of successful living that we're maybe ignoring.
Well, but you remember the insider pricing from the 80s and all that? You were so excited if your rental was going to go co-op and you got an insider's price. And
That was before me, but, yes, I.
I mean, I agree, believe me, I was hearing the age to the
Yeah.
spots and everything, but, I mean, I think the desire to own, I mean, I just remember everybody like, oh, I'm gonna have units and inside of unit. So there is something in us, there is something that maybe, even then, I do remember that being seen as lucky. That you could buy and get an insider's price and own.
If you wanted to stay in one place.
Yeah.
But I know Emily wanted to
Well,
speak.
I just know that for my parents' generation, as children of immigrants in this city, it was a huge thing to be able to own your home. And it was both a frightening thing and, you know, something of value. The fact that you could come here and buy your home and not be a renter. And from different sides of my family, I had one side that were successful but afraid to own a home because it came with responsibilities, which meant you would have to take care of it, and what would you do if you know, your business went out, yeah. So I think that the stakes have changed, and the idea that it's such an accomplishment to own your home is different in this generation than it was in the past. But I don't know, it's something that I never really, I never thought that I would. So it's always kind of an amazing thing to be able to have that.
I add something to what she just said, because you said it in Europe, and I come from Europe, and in fact, the whole approach to private property is different, and it's sort of people feel it started when the society was mostly based on peasants who did not own their place. So it became a sign of independence when finally people could afford to actually own their land and then their house, etc. So now it seems to me almost people feel almost it's a right to own something. And I was saying also what actually Bill was saying before, it really helps the fact that you don't pay for schools, you don't pay for colleges, so parents really do tend to help. If there is one help they give their children, it's definitely a home. Even a tiny little thing, it doesn't really matter, but something that they own. And I think it is really a feeling of, as you say, accomplishment. So I think a lot of these people that emigrated.
And shame if you weren't able to.
Right.
Exactly.
I mean,
I mean, if you grew up and couldn't afford to.
I don't want to interrupt too much, but I mean, the shame thing, part of this project grew out of, like, when Jen and I were talking, I feel a sense of shame of not being able to buy a place at 40 years old. Like, I can't buy a place, I don't have the money, didn't have the money from my mom. We were just talking about how my mom took her inheritance and spent it on herself, and it was awesome. Thank you, Mom, you took care of us when we were kids, but no help there. And so I do feel a sense of shame, like I can't get it together to buy a piece of property, and I feel that that's like my bad. The second thing I just want to come back to, that notion of community or people or bodies or the kind of other values that we create that then get kind of tied to property, which again is a convention, right? Like before, when there were kings and, you know, like they owned the land, it was their divine right, right? You know, peasants trying to own land or develop the concept of what private property is relatively new. But when we talk about land, I just want to read one quote from a book that Jen and I are reading, and the writer's talking more about ecology and how land is used, maybe thinking about how like farmers affect each other. But I think the quote's relevant. When a growing community causes vacant land, and in the context of anyone who grew up and spent time in Williamsburg or Bushwick, it's not all displacement. There were empty factories, there were places that were underutilized, and artists moved there and were working in there. But we could, you know, they're all tied together. But when a growing community causes vacant land to rise in value, as was happening in city after city, and sort of thinking about New York after the 1970s, should not that value accrue to the community that created it, rather than the landowner who had nothing particular to bring it about? Why should a private landowner get rich from a bounty that nature alone provided, when nature was the common heritage of all? And I guess I'm sort of saying, if we think about this kind of idea of bounty that land or nature creates, is also what the community creates. And isn't it the kind of common heritage or benefit to everyone in a community? and not just like the people, you know, like artists came to Brooklyn and made it cool and hip and suddenly you have condos. There were existing communities there, and who gets to share in that surplus value that kind of culture brings to it, you know? Because it's a there seems to be a lot more to it than just like you own your property. Why does the value go up in certain neighborhoods? You know, and art is often implicated in that. Like it makes a neighborhood cool or interesting, as you know, said Andrew. Like it is maybe more interesting for certain people or a certain type of culture, but the property values do go up. You know, and then displacement happens, gentrification happens. So I guess the sort of question is who gets to share in this like rise in value?
One of the things that struck me the most about this book that we're reading is called The Land We Share by, the last name is Freivogel. We have a copy over there actually. But it goes into the origins of property law in the US. And one thing that has really struck me is that property law seems to have really evolved like in an interesting way over the last 200 years. Like originally it was very understood that if you owned property, you had these enormous responsibilities to the community at large, to future generations, to it was more like stewardship, and of course you would have all of these rules would apply to you because you own property. And I feel like now we have this sense that, like somebody said, property is a right. I mean, obviously, property is not a right. We can see who has it and who doesn't. But the sense that, like, if we own something, we should be able to get to do whatever we want with it. Like, we shouldn't be constrained. We're, like, annoyed by tenants associations. We're annoyed by, like, homeowners associations. Like, why can't I put an arch? Why can't I paint my house blue, you know, if I live in the subdivision?
If I wanted to, I could light up a cigarette right now. It's not a restaurant, it's not a regulation. I wouldn't do it because I respect you guys, but,
I'll have one.
you know. This is, you know.
It's just
But,
I'm just saying, I could.
but one of the things I think about with this sort of, the idea of private property and land owning and stuff is something has happened with our culture where we don't stay in one place. You know, our families don't stay in one place and we live with our parents until we're able to get married and then they come back and live with us. And so the fact that we're moving around, you know, you don't have a home that gets passed down to the next generation.
She could though, Jen could.
Jen
She's
could.
actually done it.
Well, and I'm a little
And
bit of that
we have
too.
somebody I know who lives with
I'm
parents here.
that experience. So, but it says something about our culture. But I think that there's you have a stake in a piece of property if your family has owned that land or that house or that apartment for generations, and you take care of it, and you're invested in the community, and that's part of what the whole idea of gentrification. That's part of what's getting destroyed as people are staying there. But if they don't own their home, then they can't have that like foothold where they can maintain their life and their community. And
So, I know we're not from Manhattan, we don't live in Manhattan, this is very Manhattan, or New York City centered conversation, and do you wanna bring up home value prices are not rising in the rest of the country. So homeownership, while a privilege and does bring you value in the rest of the country, for the most part, it is bringing people a lot of despair. And I don't wanna ignore that. People could have bought a house in the 90s and it's worth 70, 60, 50% of what it was worth 20 years ago. So there's no freedom, as Andy was mentioning. People can't sell their homes because they owe too much money, they owe way more than the home is worth. So I did want to bring that up. Like here, yes, being an owner means that I am going to have value later. That's not true.
Can you just amplify that a little bit? Like, so do people want to own for other, like, do people still, what does that do to the culture of, the idea of owning or renting?
I don't necessarily know that everyone does want to own. There is a sense of risk that I don't think is quite the same here. Like, if you buy in Bushwick, like, it's gonna keep being gentrified, right? Like, the value's gonna go up. It's true for big cities, I think, in other places in the US, but to buy like a suburban home and like a development where like some builder is building.
That, I would just wanna ask that question, right? So somebody bought a large tract of land, a developer, and subdivided it into many little dream McMansions or homes, probably too big to heat, probably overpriced, and then sells it to somebody and says, you're now achieved the American dream.
And
Right.
those loans are going at 0% down.
Right.
You get first home buyer incentive. You maybe it's an adjustable rate mortgage, so you're paying really cheap for the first 5 to 10 years, and then it's skyrocketing.
College isn't free, but money is.
Money is free in
Debt
these
is
types of situations, right?
Debt,
At least
right.
for a little
Temporarily
while.
free, yeah, debt is
Debt is
temporarily
free.
free.
Temporarily free, but in these markets it is, right? They're trying to get people into these homes.
Mm-hmm.
5-10 years down the line, those homes are not worth what they were quoted to be worth because they're creating stuff out of thin air, right? They're turning farmland into suburbs.
How do we not think this is happening here?
Well,
Well, it has happened. I mean, the real estate values have crashed in New York,
No,
but it's
no,
been
no.
30 years ago.
They're
Wait, in
crashed.
'89?
89, there was a
Yeah, I
big
know. I
crash.
know a lot of people whose
Right.
families lost their.
Lost their
Yeah.
But they're back to.
But there's a big
Wait, let's let Jen and then Emily and then Andrew.
No, I'm done.
You're done?
I was just
I'm
saying
done.
they
I'm
have
done.
crashed. It's been a long
Andrew, go
time.
No, but I mean, you know, like the stock market in October 1929, like it's back far beyond where it was. I mean, and this is New York centric, but it's back far beyond where it was after any crash. If you were able to hold the property, I mean,
That's a big
yes,
if. Yeah,
That's a
big
big
if.
if, but it's not that the market stayed depressed for maybe 89 longer, but 2008, it's back within 3 years.
It was a blip.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sitting here listening, thinking, I think Cindy, you sort of touched on it, but I'm getting more and more like, because it's like, the truth is, I mean, I think we have to even go back to own. I mean, I'm sitting here going, do I really own my place? Like,
No.
I mean, really though, I mean, first of all, I think we have to track it back. You started there, but if you have a mortgage, I mean, the truth is you don't own your place.
The bank owns it.
And I'm just gonna say, and secondarily, if you're in a co-op, at least in my co-op, you really don't own, I'm telling you, it's serious. So, you know, like, I look at it and I go, man, all the layer, I mean, you know, you can think you own, but I'm looking at the layers between what ownership means and what reality is. And, but if we just go to having a mortgage in this world, in this capitalist economy, I'm like, what on earth are we all, I mean, it's just me, I'm just having a moment. I'm like, girl, you're kidding. Like, you don't really own your place, the bank does. And in this world we live in today, that's serious. I mean, that's real. Like, a bank owning your place. And I know I got a little hit of it because my apartment flooded in Sandy. And I was out a year, and I can tell you, it wasn't about 3 or 4 days, but the bank swoops in and starts telling you everything you're gonna have to do to bring your property back. So, you know, it's a hit. And, you know, we live in a very capitalist society, and banks have tons of clout. And we've already experienced things hanging on by a thread from 2008, but I think it's still hanging on by a thread. And so, you know, let things shift a little, let energy shift. I mean, I look at it and go, pretty soon our freaking, in most of these places, our energy bills are gonna be more than our mortgage. So, you know, there's a lot of things that we're like teetering between ourselves and a bank that really owns our place. You know, and in this country, things could shift very quickly in our economy. And somebody brought up the depression, you know, like it, you know, I did think of it during Sandy, and I'm thinking of it right now, like, how is a tiny line, fragility of, if things shift and things get really tough, you know, do we really own? Because the banks can step in quick, you know what I'm saying, like, they're not really that tolerant, and we know that from what you just said. So I guess for me, I think maybe my own personal being is track it back. Do you really own? Like, yeah, your bank owns it, and what does that really mean? And what does it mean to really own property?
I want to piggyback on the evil of capitalism. I totally agree.
Yeah.
So I agree with Sydney said. There's a great film that Herzog did called Caspar Hauser from like mid 80s or later, maybe late 70s. And it's all about buying the American dream. And he gets everything, a little trailer home and a dishwasher and all his things, and then he doesn't understand what's going on. He loses it all eventually, and they take everything away from him. He's got nothing. There's a great scene with the dancing chicken in the end where it all ends up. But the other thing I wanted to add is we're having a bit of a thing with our broker, and our broker likes to talk a lot about projections. How much money we're going to have in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Doesn't really talk so much about the fees they're charging all the time. I'm talking about investments. And always says, no, it's totally transparent. It's like it's not. We had to dig it out and find what the numbers are, and she's like really into how much money we're gonna have, and it's never mind how much money we have or what they're taking from us, Merrill Lynch. And that conversation is really, she's a really nice person, but I've called her, I said, you're actually representing the evil banks that are destroying all of us. She's like, oh, no, but she's nice, and she's a very nice person. But she's always talking about the projections about how much I'm gonna have, which I think is the problem with capitalism. It's always like, what are we gonna have? Don't buy now.
Well, it appeals to your greed, basically. It
Yeah.
appeals to your greed.
How much are you gonna get?
Sorry, but I agree with you totally. It's like, that's why I was thinking of Sandy, where suddenly the bank was mandating to me what I was gonna have to do to remedy. I mean, it's kind of weird to see your house completely gutted down to the concrete, like you were living in 2 days ago, which is what they did because that's law in New York. And then the bank comes in and they're looking at this shell going, here's your checklist, you know, so it's like who owns what, you know, and they don't care if you have insurance or you don't have insurance. And then I don't have somewhere else.
I mean, after Sandy, the amazing thing was like, I mean, Occupy Wall Street was an amazing movement, but what it seemed to do is it created an infrastructure of people that when Sandy hit, suddenly it was like, you know, help everyone in Far Rockaway and get out to the hardest hit, poorest community, you know, one of the poorest communities in New York, and just to help people, you know, and bring food and supplies and those questions of ownership. I mean, I don't know how many of the residents in Far Rockaway own their buildings or were just renting and needed that support, you know, but we sort of are talking about the banks and they're like the they, right, this awful thing, the they, and, you know, we're also talking about regulation and where there's federal regulation around housing. I don't really know if Bernie or Hillary have much of a position on housing, you know, would love to know more, but state regulation and then local city regulation. And I think something that, you know, came up in the book that we're reading is just, you know, if people want to have a role in this discussion and not just feel like the banks are screwing you or a developer screwing you, then you have to actually have some sort of voice. You have to have a sense of agency in the process. And I'm not sure, I really feel like I do right now, you know, as a renter. You know, and I'm trying to work with other groups or try to find a way into that. But, you know, what is the role of decent regulation in this? Because I would push back, Andy, that like, I don't think the market is going to solve this one because it assumes a lot of things about how people act.
Okay, so, you know, I would push back on that and say, okay, let's take it away from New York. And a lot of
I can't, though I live here, so I'm going to speak for
a lot of Mall of Americas used to be the center of a community, was the mall that you have to drive through, and all of a sudden the mall can't put a roof up over its head anymore, it can't pay for it, so the mall is crumbling down, and it falls, and it is replaced by mixed-use facilities, meaning you've got commercial, residential, and retail space. And all of a sudden you built a downtown in the middle of the suburbs, and all these people who had this dream, the American dream, are obviously seeing something better. Like, wow, I want to live where the old mall used to be, because now I've got walkability, now I've got community in a place that didn't have it before.
Where is this? I want to see. This is a mall somewhere.
Yeah.
Because I spent some time in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and that place. The downtown of Sheboygan was destroyed by all the malls that were built around it, but then successively they fell into disrepair. So at this point you have like 2 Walmarts on either end of town and like a Best Buy, but then there's this blasted landscape of 30 years of sort of suburban development, and the downtown is dead, but now they've got like a farm-to-table restaurant, and
downtown is rejuvenating.
Slowly crawling back.
Well, that's because nobody wants to live in suburbia anymore. Like our values have shifted.
Yeah. But this is where the idea comes that you get the value of your life through your community and the way you live, rather than some like Wall Street that someone sold you. And the the specific case study is like in Connecticut somewhere or something like that, but like you could hope that it happens again. That a mall, the crumbling mall that we all know and love. You know, I remember the crappy mall in Pennsylvania that I used to, you know, spend time with as a teenager, and I wish that thing would down and become like, you know, one of these awesome downtown neighborhoods that you see in like New York.
But a return on your money in order to achieve before. Your plot is not easily achieved in a climate that encourages growth, whether it's growth that like drives these crazy suburban developments that aren't linked up to water or sanitation in the Sunbelt states, or whether it's like new urbanist growth in Connecticut that refabs malls into walkable downtowns. It's the two sides of the same coin. It's just like need to continue to build and to continue to grow.
Yeah, but I would say that like to bring it back to
Oh wait, I'm
yes,
gonna
I
cut
got
you
the
off real
body.
quick because Emily was waiting her turn.
I have a way to circle it back to Bill too.
And can I actually get everybody off for a second? Can someone help me to pass this to the two guys in the back who have nothing? Thank you. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, as far as the growth, the growth and bringing that back to private property and regulation, I think part of the problem with growth and new development and affordability with housing is that all of the tax abatement and the incentives skew towards the developers. And so if the regulation, the governmental, the city regulation is skewed so that maybe the developers can build, but they don't get tax breaks. Maybe they're just forced to have a certain percentage that's affordable housing in Midtown Manhattan, and they just have to deal with it. Then maybe that will start shifting the scale so that it's not, you know, they have the tax abatements and that's so that the developers can sell their apartments, you know, like that, and it doesn't benefit anyone. So to me, it seems like regulation is key where not every, you know, it's skewed towards the renter and the buyer and not towards the developer.
And I just want to add to that and tell an anecdote that everyone might not know about Battery Park City. So Battery Park City is built on the landfill of the First World Trade Tower. And the developers said to the city, look, no one wants to live on landfill. You're going to have to give us some really great tax incentives. And so they said, okay, well, how about you don't pay city taxes? All your city taxes will just go to Battery Park City. So developers were like, great, and they built all luxury condos, and the taxes from where the 1% in Manhattan really live just go to Battery Park City. And when we talk about how do you incentivize middle class housing, affordable housing in New York City, it's not an impossible ask. You just have to make sure that city government officials don't make those kinds of deals. That they are perhaps too myopic to understand where that will go, but we've all learned from the past exactly how it ends up.
And, you know, I would piggyback on that by saying that, like, part of this is, if the incentives are voluntary, you know, and you ask somebody, like, you could do, say, the right thing here in this situation, if it's just voluntary, it puts the burden back on, like, an individual, whether it's a developer, it's not law, you know, and that's something that I think the city is sort of, like, right now it's all deals, you know, the 421A tax abatement, which was used as leverage that could give the developer an incentive to put in low or affordable income housing in their place. That law expired, and that's a state law. And again, these are like sort of like some structural things that I didn't know shit about until about 5 years ago, but like who controls housing laws in New York City? It's the state. And so it's like this ERSAT law that makes that happen. You know, I didn't realize that like Clinton was responsible for saying we're no more public housing. The federal government's out of the game in terms of building new public housing. And at the city level, you know, it's community boards and city council dealing with like rezoning, but community board members are not elected. you know. And so the one point that when we talk about the city or government, like we're talking about them representing our common will, or like the people, citizens, that if you had time to engage in this kind of work, you might not think of like the city as this other, you know, or government, like, oh, they're terrible, they're just out screwing us, or they're in collusion with developers. But that's supposed to be our voice, you know, and if we don't have a voice or we don't feel like we have agency in this, then it's, I don't know, you know, I'd rather be an owner and just have my tract of land or my apartment and be able to do what I want within it, you know, because then I have a sense that I can do something, you know.
Well, I haven't been a renter for a long time, but it seems when I moved to the city about 31 years ago that there were many more rentals available, and there were stronger renters' rights. And I think that's what's happening to people who rent, and there's always people who are going to need to rent. And I mean, I'm just going through, I remember reading a Nora Ephron book, and she grew up in New York. I'm just saying she grew up in New York. I just remember it because, but she was like determined to get an apartment. This is a story up on the Upper West Side with because she just had a belief like my parents rented, New Yorkers always rent, and I'm gonna be a renter. And then finally, because her income was a certain point, they kicked her out because they're making it a co-op and she couldn't rent anymore. But she was like, I don't get it because I'm a New Yorker and I should be able to rent this, but I have rent, you know, security. So it is an issue that renters are getting, I feel, less and less rights. I mean, I remember renters' rights were, some of my friends like took it to, you know, to small claims court and won, and there was just a stronger community and rights, and I think that's just being lost. Like I said, I'm not an experienced renter because I haven't rented in a long time, but there seems to be stronger renters' rights, and people, you know, knew I'm a renter, and that's what I am. I mean, that's, you know, and you had security in that. So I don't know. That's the problem. It has to do with, you know,
I think
community boards and all
exactly what
that.
you said. It is, you're probably absolutely right, but there is an example that just happened with a friend of mine. She got bed bugs in her apartment, and if anyone has experienced that, you know, it's a nightmare. So everything had to be fumigated, and it was a huge thing. And she was renting an apartment, and apparently this came from another apartment that was not properly treated and came through the pipes, whatever. So she went to the landlord to get some kind of deal because she had to physically be out of the apartment for almost 2 months, and went to an hotel, and then all the cost of doing all that, and threw out a lot of those things. And the landlord didn't do anything and started to use excuses after excuses after excuses. And the problem was, at some point she thought, okay, I am going to go to a small court and bring a lawsuit to him. Then she decided against it because apparently if you sue your landlord, it would stay on your record, and then it will be apparently impossible for you to rent anywhere else in the city. How is that right?
It's not right.
Toya,
Did she go to HPD?
I don't know, actually. Thank you. Can you
Tell us.
elaborate on
Yeah,
that?
Housing.
Public development.
It's part of the city agency, you have a problem with the landlord, you can go complain to them. I don't know if they might have been able to remedy a problem with the landlord, or he might have had I don't know exactly, but she could have went to them, even filed a complaint with 311.
Right. I think she went to 311, but
Yeah,
I'm
but
not
she
totally sure what happened. And then at the end, she actually ended up leaving the apartment, which is really
But
not.
HPD might
That's
have been able
terrible.
to remedy
Yeah.
just
and it sounds like the thing, you know, as artists who show in galleries, if an artist ever sues a gallery for not paying them the money from their own art sales, then they're really at risk of never showing in any other gallery. And then that makes the fine arts world a very hazardous world. But when I did not realize that it was at the level of like that actually also applies to your home, which is
But what, I'm confused though, what document would they even see? Like what kind
well,
of
it's on
renter
public.
It's a public record.
It's public record if you
Oh.
sue. So a landlord won't rent to someone who sued a previous landlord.
I
It makes sense.
I guess, but I just feel like in the era of Craigslist and whatever, no one looks at that. Like you
Oh,
barely
oh,
talk
oh,
about
I
it.
think people
That's what I initially told them,
Yeah.
and then
Well, look
instead,
at that.
no, they said it's very common that they do a background check because they want to avoid any problems.
So, I just want to add real quick, so to your point, when I moved to Bushwick 10 years ago, I lived across the park, I paid $1,000, David, my landlord, was like, do you have $1,000 in cash? And I was like, yes, I do. And he's like, great, the place is yours. That's not the case anymore.
Well, and this is what I just want to add one thing. We have we have other discussions coming, and one is going to be with developers and real estate professionals. So we're not out to like demonize them completely because we do need new things, new buildings. How it's done seems to be really important to us, right? Another thing though is we have a dinner with housing policy experts or people that maybe have a slightly different perspective from the market. And one of them is somebody who's writing a history of renters. And one thing that renting does allow for, we're a lot of white people here, right? And probably American citizens, but there are a lot of people who rent in the city who are not citizens. And to provide the documentation that you need to get that apartment or to buy a place, it's not accessible. So renting also does provide a different kind of freedom, not just in mobility, but also access to being here and staying here. And so when we talk about displacement or ownership is really a privilege of both citizenship and money, and it's something that not everyone has access to. So I think we're sort of winding down the discussion in the last 10 minutes here, but I would point that out that like if you follow along or pay attention to the discussions that come out of this, like there are so many different perspectives around this that some you don't even think about sometimes. Like, oh shit, renting is actually really important if it's just, like a cash deal, and you want to be here and not provide your papers.
I also just wanted to make one more point, is that on both sides of the table, we've all been talking about inflexibility and lack of freedom. So you don't feel free to own, you don't feel secure in your ownership, and we don't feel secure in our rentership. And people who own houses in the suburbs certainly don't feel secure in their ownership. And we have this case where, basically wealth is concentrated. And as wealth concentrates, you lose flexibility and you lose freedom. And it's interesting to me that both sides of the table really feel this palpably.
Can I say something about maybe possibly one of the root causes of that is probably inflation? And we've all, I mean, seriously, this is one of those things. My dad has this thing where like, oh, you should buy a truck. Because you're gonna buy your truck in 2006 and then you're paying it off in $2006 always. So like a business, any kind of thing they buy, and that's great if you're my dad and you like raises and your income level increased through your 30s and your 40s and your 50s.
Our income level hasn't done anything.
Yes.
Set.
So in our generation, we have a plateau. So taxes, rent increases, all these things, we feel so much more than we did in our parents' generation because there has been no inflation. It's a lie that like we've just accepted, and we've accepted that it's good, and it's not.
Well, I would like to see wage increases go up.
Yeah, but I mean that's the way they can avoid wage increases. They
We're
say
gonna go down
inflation
here,
doesn't
who hasn't
exist.
talked about it. Just really quick, I'm gonna add to that our parents' generation didn't have as much debt as we did.
Right, because debt was more expensive.
Yeah.
Because the same way there's not inflation, there also our interest rates are really low, right?
Well, and they didn't pay as much to go to school.
Right.
Right.
We have public universities in California. Reagan put an end to that. So.
New York, you can go to college.
I know.
Not a Reagan fan.
Well, no, I meant the public university.
Okay.
Yeah,
yes,
public university in California, right there, yeah.
HPD is called the Housing Preservation and Development. If you go to their website, they have tenants' rights, report an issue, find housing.
Thank you.
And that's really important. I mean, the fact that there are resources that people do not avail themselves or know about, you know, and that's, again, like, we were just saying before we got here, it's like, people come to the city, they don't know what the rents are, they don't know what things are, then they don't find out until they get fucked, or they find themselves in a bad situation, and then they feel a sense of solidarity. And that's precisely what's happening to a lot of communities in New York that are not represented at this discussion tonight. They were last night, and I mean, you were there. I mean, there was each community in this city feels different pressures, you know, whether they're renters or owners, and different lures, you know, like, oh, you've got a beautiful brownstone in Bed-Stuy, and you've owned it for a couple of generations, you want to sell it for like 3 times as much. Yeah, I mean, it's all sort of in play, so.
Well, I will say though that, that I, as an owner, I feel like I actually do have more stability. I feel like actually I can continue to live where I live, and I don't, I feel like obviously nobody feels completely secure, and I think you're right that that's the thread going through this. But I feel super privileged to own.
And her neighbor's gonna build 2 more stories.
Yeah, my neighbors are building all around me, like I'm closing us in. But, and who are listening probably, hi. But I feel really, you know, that it just means that I can continue to live in this city, and I know that that's not true for a lot of people I really care about.
Yeah.
I would add to that, what I was trying to say, and what Don and I'm sorry, I can't see your name, but just about capitalism. I think that's true as long as values grow. And I think to what Cindy was saying is that we happen to live in New York where we make a big assumption that real estate's a good investment and things are gonna go up and they're gonna grow.
It's a risk.
And I think, you know, maybe I didn't articulate it super clearly because I was still trying to, something just hit me sitting in this room, but I think maybe where I feel it's not apparent like right now, but the minute our investments don't hold their value and they go below market, that's a whole nother story, right? And there goes your freedom, right? And then suddenly you're still obliged to pay the mortgage you have and all those things, but it's for something that you can't sell, or if you sell it, you're going to sell it for a loss. So back to the banks owning you. I mean, it's freedom. It's relative, right? It's relative on the speculation that the market is going to continue to grow and be healthy and prosper, but we don't know that, right? So maybe that's what maybe you're picking up on is. It is. I agree with you, right? I mean, until this moment, sitting here, I do think it's a privilege. I do feel it gives freedom, but I think it's relative to the value of your property and then the power of banks, right? Unless you own it outright. Maybe that's the ultimate freedom. Is owning outright.
And also, I mean, the market downturn is bad across the board. I mean, there are less jobs and
Right,
less
so
for
then
renters as well.
suddenly your income goes down, so you can afford less.
And people don't want to buy then. So actually, the down economy is the reason renting is so hard. When home values go down, when renting goes up, and rent prices they're actually inversely related. Thank you. When home prices are down for a while, the renting prices go up.
So you can't sell quickly, right? If you're suddenly
Right.
value.
Supply.
If your home
Supply.
goes down,
Supply of pizza.
you can't sell it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I would, the last note I would end on is we're all living in New York City right now, I imagine, most of us. I don't want to assume everyone lives here, but we did come here for certain reasons, and some of that is the cultural value, of being in New York. And it attracts a lot of people who, you could live elsewhere for a lot less, but we've chosen to live here, and that desire, whether it's graffiti tours out in Bushwick or girls tours in Greenpoint, there is a cultural value that people want to be here and they're willing to pay a lot more than other places, but that is not everyone's culture that lives in New York City.
That's right.
And I think there's one last quote from the book that I thought was relevant. It sounds old-timey, but like, when development would undercut the settled life, which interest should the law favor? And when I think of the settled life in New York, I think of like Crown Heights or communities, and it's never like, New York City is a city of immigrants and people coming and going, but when people have been there for a long time and other people are coming and want what they have, and the market is just sort of like